Welcome to Deep Dive into Knowledge.
From caves to screens, the 30,000-year evolution of animation.
Hello and welcome to Deep Dive into Knowledge. It is wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you.
I want to start our time today by asking you, the listener, to do something for me. Just for a moment, I want you to think about the last time you sat in a cinema, or maybe just curled up on your sofa in the dark, watching a screen. I want you to really focus on a very specific physical sensation. You are watching a series of lights flickering on a flat surface.
Right.
You know, logically, that what you are seeing isn't real. It has no mass. It doesn't have a heartbeat.
No.
It doesn't have lungs to breathe the air. It is just code or ink or pixels. It is quite literally a trick of the light.
Yes.
And yet, something strange happens. As you watch these static images flash by, you feel a lump forming in your throat.
Okay.
You might find yourself laughing out loud at a joke made by a drawing. You might even feel tears prickling your eyes because a creature made of software is sad.
Exactly.
We mourn for characters that are nothing more than digital geometry. We fear for things that do not exist. We surrender to the deception completely.
We give ourselves over to it.
It is a paradox, isn't it? We pride ourselves on being rational creatures, yet we can be emotionally devastated by the inanimate. It makes you wonder if this is just a modern obsession. Is it just because our technology is so good, so hypnotic, that we cannot look away?
Right.
Or is this desire to breathe life into the stillness, is that something older, something that has been haunting the human mind since we first had hands to draw with?
I think you'll find it is much older.
Today, we are going to explore that paradox. We are going to look at the history of the moving image. But I have a feeling we're going to find that it is not really a history of technology at all.
No, it is.
It is a history of a very specific human desire. So if we strip away the screens, the software, the billions of dollars at the box office, where does this impulse to make pictures move actually begin?
It begins in the dark. And it begins much further back than most people would ever guess. If we want to find the true origin of this story, we cannot start in a Hollywood studio in the 1920s. We have to go back roughly 30,000 years.
30,000 years. That feels almost impossible to visualize. We are talking about the Paleolithic era.
We're talking about the deep caves scattered across Europe. When archaeologists and anthropologists first began studying the cave paintings in places like Chauvet or Lascaux in France, they were obviously struck by the beauty of the art.
Naturally.
You see bison, horses, lions, the animals these early humans lived alongside and hunted. But as they looked closer at the anatomy, they noticed something that seemed like a mistake.
A mistake, like they drew the animals incorrectly.
That was the initial assumption, yes. You would look at a bison on the wall, and it would have 8 legs.
8 legs?
Yes. Or you would see a horse that appeared to have 2 heads or multiple backs stacked on top of one another. For a long time, the academic view was that these were errors or perhaps depictions of fantasy creatures, monsters from a myth we have lost. Or maybe just a primitive attempt that went wrong.
But these were people who hunted these animals every day. They knew what a bison looked like. They knew it did not have 8 legs.
Exactly. And that is what did not sit right with modern researchers. So they changed how they looked at the images.
Yeah.
You have to remember, these paintings were never meant to be seen under the steady, flat white light of an electric bulb or a museum floodlight.
Right.
They were painted deep underground in pitch blackness. The only light source would have been a flickering torch or a grease lamp.
And fire flickers. It dances.
It does. And that is the key. When you view these 8-legged bison under the flickering light of a torch, something incredible happens. The shifting shadows interacting with the superimposed legs make the animal appear to move.
Oh, wow.
The 8 legs aren't a mistake. They are a sophisticated attempt to capture motion blur.
So they were basically trying to...
Draw the animal running, yes.
They were drawing it in motion.
They were. They were superimposing the limbs to simulate the churning of legs in a sprint. It is the earliest known attempt at animation.
Yeah.
They were trying to break the static nature of the stone. They wanted the bison to run across the wall.
That is genuinely profound. It suggests that animation is not a technological invention at all. It is a psychological need. The moment we could draw, we were frustrated that the drawing sat still.
The urge is universal. We see it pop up again and again throughout human history. If you look at ancient Egypt, specifically the murals in the tomb of Beni Hassan, which are about 4,000 years old, you see it in a different form.
What did they draw?
There are depictions of wrestling matches, but instead of just one image of a fight, You have a long row of couples.
Almost like a comic strip.
Very much so. One image shows the grapple, the next shows the lift, the next shows the throw, and the final image shows the pin. They were breaking a single action into frame-by-frame snippets.
That is fascinating.
If you were to copy those images onto cards and flip through them, you would have a smooth animation of a wrestling takedown. They were deconstructing time into a sequence.
They invented the storyboard before they had the camera.
They did. And then the Greeks took that desire and moved it from the physical to the spiritual. We have the myth of Pygmalion.
The sculptor who fell in love with his statue.
Yes. According to the legend, Pygmalion carved a statue of a woman out of ivory. He worked with such obsession and such love that the statue became more beautiful than any living woman.
Right.
He brought it gifts, he spoke to it, and eventually he prayed to the goddess Venus to bring it to life. And the myth says she did. The ivory softened and the pulse began to beat. That myth is the spiritual ancestor of every animator working today.
The desire to create life from raw material.
Exactly. To play creator with ink or clay.
It is interesting that you use such lofty terms, creating life, because the terminology we use today feels so much smaller than that. When I say the word cartoon, I think most people immediately associate it with something trivial.
Yes,
something for kids. Saturday mornings, sugary cereal, bright colors. It implies a lack of seriousness. But I have a suspicion that the word itself did not always mean a silly drawing.
You are right to be suspicious. The linguistic shift of the word cartoon is actually a fascinating degradation of meaning. If you were to travel back to the Renaissance, to the time of the High Masters, and you spoke of a cartoon, you would be talking about something incredibly serious, expensive, and technically difficult.
What was a cartoon in the time of the Renaissance?
Historically, a cartoon derived from the Italian word cartone, meaning a large sheet of paper was a full-scale preparatory drawing for a major piece of high art.
Oh, I see.
If you were going to paint a fresco on a wet plaster wall or weave an intricate tapestry or design a stained glass window, you could not just start improvising. You needed a blueprint, a one-to-one scale drawing.
So Leonardo da Vinci made cartoons.
He did. Michelangelo, Raphael, they all made cartoons. And these were not doodles. These were masterpieces in their own right, often done in charcoal or chalk on heavy paper.
How did they use them on the walls?
They would prick tiny holes along the outlines of the drawing. Then they would hold the paper up to the wall and pat a bag of charcoal dust over the holes. It was a process called pouncing. The dust would go through the holes and leave a dotted outline on the wall for the painter to follow.
That sounds incredibly laborious.
It was. These cartoons were the skeletons of the masterpieces we admire today.
So how did we get from Michelangelo's blueprints to, well, a cat getting hit with a frying pan?
The pivot point lies in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was driven by the printing press. As printing became cheaper and newspapers became common, there was a massive demand for visual content. Artists began to use this preparatory style of drawing not for frescoes, but for satire.
This is the era of artists like William Hogarth.
Precisely. Hogarth, Francisco Goya, Honoré Daumier, these were artists who looked at the social injustices of their time, the poverty, the corruption, the hypocrisy of the elite, and they used their pens to attack it. The medium shifted from preparation for art to satirical illustration.
And that is where the word changed.
It happened in London in the 1840s. Punch magazine, which was the premier satirical publication at the time, started using the term cartoon to describe their full-page satirical drawings.
Were they referencing the old meaning?
They were actually being ironic. At the time, the Houses of Parliament were commissioning grand, high-art cartoons for murals in the new palace. Punch was mocking them. They were essentially saying, you have your cartoons for the palace, and we have our cartoons for the people.
That is a very British form of mockery, taking a higher art term and dragging it into the mud to make a point.
It is. And the name stuck.
Right.
The cartoon stopped being a blueprint for a painting and became a weapon against the powerful.
That leads us nicely into the power of that weapon, because when we look at those early drawings, they were not just for a quick laugh, were they? We tend to look at political cartoons now as perhaps a bit quaint, something tucked away in the editorial section. But in the 19th century, this was the mass media.
It was the only visual mass media, and its influence was brutal. You have to remember, before photography was widespread, and certainly before radio or television, a drawing was the primary way to define a public figure's image.
Right.
If a cartoonist decided you were a monster, you became a monster in the public imagination. Charivari in France, started in 1832, did exactly this. So did The Judge in Life in America.
Can you give us an example of that kind of impact?
The most famous example is probably Boss Tweed in New York. He was a corrupt politician running the Tammany Hall machine in the 1870s. He was stealing millions. The articles written about him were damning, but he did not care about the text.
Why not?
He famously said, "I don't care what the papers write about me. My constituents can't read, but they can see them damn pictures."
You can see the pictures. That really cuts to the heart of it. It bypasses literacy. It bypasses complex argument. It hits you viscerally.
It does. The cartoonist Thomas Nast drew Tweed as a bloated, corrupt giant, often with a money bag for a head, and those images brought him down. Yes, he was eventually arrested, and when he fled to Spain, he was recognized and captured. Not because of a photograph, but because a Spanish official recognized him from a Thomas Nast cartoon.
That is incredible. And that tradition has not really gone away, has it? Even with all our technology, the political cartoon is still around.
It survives remarkably intact. If we jump all the way to 2024, the political cartoon was still a dominant force in the cultural conversation. We have social media, we have 24-hour news cycles, and yet the single panel drawing remains highly effective.
It is amazing it still works.
In 2024, editorial cartoonists were tackling everything from housing shortages to the rise of artificial intelligence.
I recall seeing quite a few surrounding the U.S. elections that year as well.
Indeed. There was a significant wave of cartoons surrounding the childless cat lady's comments made by J.D. Vance during the election cycle. Now, the cat lady is a trope that cartoonists have used for a century, usually to mock single women.
Yes, it is quite an old trope.
But in 2024, cartoonists reclaimed and satirized it instantly. You saw drawings of women with cats as superheroes or as a formidable voting bloc. It became a visual shorthand for a massive cultural debate. Regardless of one's politics, it showed the power of the medium.
We should note that we are looking at this purely as an example of how visual shorthand operates in mass media. We are not taking any political sides here.
Of course not. It is simply a modern demonstration of the same mechanism Thomas Nast used.
It is fascinating that even with all our technology, we still revert to the pen and ink sketch to make a point. There is a direct line from Boss Tweed to the 2024 election.
There is. And sometimes the scale of these things is literal. There was a cartoon, possibly the biggest of all time, physically drawn on a building behind the United Nations headquarters in New York.
Really? How big was it?
It was 11 meters tall and 9 meters wide. It was a satire of Cold War relations. Just imagine that. A political joke drawn 2 stories high, right in the face of the world's diplomats. That is the power of the cartoon.
So we have the urge to move from the caves. We have the satirical bite from the newspapers. But we are still looking at static images. We are still looking at frozen moments. When does the picture actually start to move? When does the magic trick actually work?
This is where most people get the history wrong. We tend to assume that animation was a byproduct of the movie camera. We think someone invented film, and then someone else thought, I can film drawings.
That is what I always assumed.
But that is backward. We figured out how to move drawings before we could record reality.
We did.
Yes. The science of motion perception, what we call the persistence of vision, was being explored in the early 19th century, decades before the cinema was born. And it came at a high cost.
What do you mean a high cost?
Well, take the story of Joseph Plateau. He was a Belgian physicist in the early 1800s. He was obsessed with how the retina retains images. To understand this, he performed an experiment where he stared directly into the midday sun for 25 seconds.
He stared at the sun for 25 seconds.
He did. He wanted to see what the afterimage would look like, how long it would last, and how it would change color. It eventually cost him his eyesight. He went permanently blind later in life.
That is tragic.
It is, but his research led him to invent the phenakistoscope in 1832.
The phenakistoscope? That is quite a name. How did it work?
It was a simple device, but it relied on a very specific optical trick. It was a spinning cardboard disc attached to a handle. You would draw a sequence of images around the edge of the disc, say a couple dancing, and between each drawing, you would cut a small, narrow slit.
Okay, so a disc with drawings and slits.
Right. Now, if you just spin the disc and look at it, it looks like a blur. You just see a smear of color. But Plateau realized that if you stand in front of a mirror, look through the slits from the back of the disc, and spin it, the magic happens.
Why do the slits matter?
The slit acts as a shutter. That is the crucial part. Your eye sees the image for a split second, and then the solid cardboard blocks your view. Then the slit comes around again, and you see the next image.
So it chops up what you see.
Exactly. This chopping up of the vision prevents the blur. Your brain takes these flash frozen images and stitches them together, and suddenly, in the mirror, the couple is dancing.
That must have seemed like absolute sorcery in 1832.
It was science that felt like magic. It proved that the eye could be tricked. Then in 1834, William George Horner improved it with the Zoetrope. That is the one people often recognize, a drum with slits on the side.
Ah, yes, I have seen those in museums.
You put a strip of paper inside, spin the drum, and look through the side. No mirror needed. And by 1876, Emile Reynaud created the praxinoscope.
What did that do differently?
Reynaud replaced the slits with mirrors in the center of the drum. This made the image much brighter and clearer because you are not blocking the light with cardboard. Reynaud actually took this a step further. He projected these images for theatrical audiences in Paris. He called it the théâtre optique.
Wait, so the audience was sitting in a theater watching animated stories before they had ever seen a film of a real train arriving at a station?
Precisely. They were watching illuminated, moving drawings tell a story in 1892. The animated world predates the recorded world.
So when the film camera finally does arrive, when the Lumiere brothers and Edison finally figure out how to capture reality on celluloid, how did the animators react? Did they embrace it immediately?
They did, but it was experimental. It was strange. The early animated films are actually quite unsettling to watch today. They have a surreal, dreamlike quality.
I have seen clips of some of them. They often involve chalkboards, do they not?
Yes, the lightning sketch was a popular vaudeville act, and it translated well to film. In 1906, J. Stuart Blackton made humorous Phases of Funny Faces. It is essentially stop motion. You see a hand drawing a face on a chalkboard, and then the hand disappears and the face starts smiling or winking. It looks like a ghost is drawing.
It is a bit spooky. It is haunting.
Then in 1908, Emile Cole gave us Phantasmagory. That is often cited as the first traditional animated film. It involves stick figures morphing into bizarre shapes. A man becomes a flower, then a building. It is stream of consciousness, visual chaos. But the real breakthrough, the moment where animation became a character study, was 1914. That was Winsor McCay.
Ah, yes. Gertie the dinosaur.
Gertie. Winsor McCay was already a brilliant newspaper cartoonist. He drew Little Nemo in Slumberland, which is a masterpiece of perspective and imagination. But with Gertie, he did something new. He did not just make a drawing move. He gave it a personality.
How so?
Gertie was a dinosaur, but she acted like a puppy. She was shy, she was playful, she would get distracted by a pumpkin or a mastodon. McCay used this as part of a vaudeville act. He would stand on stage next to the projection screen with a whip and command her.
He talked to the screen.
Yes. He would say, "Gertie, lift your foot," and the animation was timed perfectly so she would obey.
That interaction must have been mind-blowing for an audience in 1914, seeing a man talk to a drawing and the drawing talking back.
It was. But the labor involved was staggering. We have to appreciate the physicality of it. McCay hand-drew thousands of frames on erase paper. But here's the kicker. He did not have layers.
What do you mean?
If Gertie was standing in front of a mountain and she moved her head, he had to redraw the mountain on the next piece of paper. He had to redraw the ground, the rocks, every single tree, thousands of times.
This sounds punishing.
It was obsessive. It was an incredible feat of endurance art. No computers, no shortcuts, just thousands of sheets of paper.
Clearly, though, the potential was too great to ignore. Which brings us, inevitably, to the mouse. For most people, the history of animation really starts with Disney. But was it just good marketing, or was it a genuine leap forward?
It was a technological pivot point. And the pivot was not the mouse itself, it was sound.
1928? Steamboat Willie.
Yes. 1928. There had been cartoons before. There had been mice before. But Steamboat Willie was the first to successfully synchronize sound and motion. When Mickey Mouse played the xylophone on the cow's teeth, the plink, plink, plink matched the action perfectly. It gave the character weight. It made the world feel tangible.
It turned a visual trick into a sensory experience.
Exactly. And we have to mention iWorks here.
iWorks often gets left out of the story, doesn't he? It is always Walt Disney.
It is. But iWorks was the genius behind the movement. He drew Steamboat Willie almost entirely by himself. He was the one who gave Mickey that specific rubbery fluid movement. But while Steamboat Willie made them famous, the real gamble, the one that changed the industry forever, came almost a decade later, in 1937.
Snow White.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Yeah.
The industry called it Disney's folly. It is hard to imagine now, but the wisdom at the time was that people would watch a cartoon for 6 minutes to laugh at a gag.
But not for a whole film.
Right. Nobody, they thought, would sit for 80 minutes to watch drawings try to be dramatic. They thought the bright colors would actually physically hurt people's eyes if they watched for that long. They thought the audience would walk out.
It seems ridiculous now, considering how massive the animated feature industry is.
It does. But Disney proved that animation could carry emotional weight. When the dwarfs mourned Snow White, audiences in 1937 wept. They were not crying for a drawing, they were crying for a soul. That film proved that animation was cinema, not just a novelty act.
And technologically, they had moved past the rice paper of Winsor McCay by then.
Yes, and this is important. They were using cell animation. This was the great efficiency breakthrough. Instead of redrawing the entire scene on every frame, you paint the background on a static board. Then you draw the character on a clear sheet of celluloid, a cell, and lay it on top.
So you only have to redraw the moving parts.
Exactly. But it was not just about efficiency. It was about chemistry. These cells were made of cellulose nitrate. They were incredibly flammable. They smelled of camphor and chemicals. The ink and paint department was this massive industrial operation where hundreds of women would trace the animator's drawings onto the front of the cell in ink and then paint the colors on the back.
On the back? Why the back?
So the brushstrokes would not show. It gave the character that perfectly flat, smooth look, and they had to be careful because the paint would dry darker than it looked when wet. So they had entire departments dedicated just to mixing colors and testing them. It was a factory, but a factory for magic.
And they also introduced the multiplane camera around this time, did they not?
They did. That was their solution to the flatness problem. It was a massive rig, standing about 14 feet high. You would put the background on the bottom layer of glass, the trees on the next layer, and the character on the top. The camera looked down through all of them. By moving the layers at different speeds, you created parallax. It is the effect where things close to you move faster than things far away. Like when you're on a train and the fence posts zip by, but the mountains in the distance barely move. The multiplane camera allowed Disney to replicate that. It gave the cartoon world depth that made it feel like a real place you could walk into.
So we have the golden age of cinema animation. The factory is humming. But then the screen in the corner of the living room lights up. Television arrives in the 1950s. And the needs of television are very different from the needs of a cinema, are they not?
Completely different. Cinema is an event. Television is a daily feed. When TV exploded in the 1950s, there was a desperate need for content. But you could not spend 3 years making 80 minutes of footage like Disney did with Snow White. You needed 20 minutes of footage every single week.
So you cannot animate every single hair on a dog's head moving in the wind. You cannot use the multiplane camera for every shot.
No. You have to cheat. And this is where Hanna-Barbera enters the picture. They mastered the art of limited animation.
What does that mean, practically? Limited sounds, well, bad.
It was not bad. It was economical. It means you hold the body still and only move the mouth. Have you ever noticed that characters like Yogi Bear or Fred Flintstone wear collars and ties?
Now that you mention it, yes. Yogi Bear wears a collar, but no shirt.
That was not a fashion choice. It was a technical trick. The collar allowed the animators to separate the head from the body. It meant they could animate the head on one cell and keep the body on a static cell underneath. If they did not have the collar, the line where the neck meets the body would jiggle and look weird. The collar hid the seam.
That is brilliant. It is a workaround that became an iconic look.
It is. They also used looping backgrounds. How many times have we seen the Flintstones run past the same lamp and potted plant or the same cloud in the sky? They reused run cycles, they reused sound effects, they focused on dialogue rather than into fluid movement.
And yet it worked. The Flintstones in 1960, Yogi Bear in 1958, Scooby-Doo in 1969. These are icons.
It worked because the writing was sharp and the characters were strong. The Flintstones was essentially a sitcom. It was the honeymooners set in the Stone Age. It proved that you did not need lush, fluid movement to hold an audience. You just needed a good story and characters they wanted to spend time with.
There is also a strong connection here back to the newspapers, isn't there? We talked about cartoons starting in print. But even in the TV era, the comic strip was a massive engine for these characters.
It was a feedback loop. You had strips like Buster Brown back in 1902, or Bringing Up Father in 1913, which was published in 71 countries. These strips built the audience. Characters like Popeye and Felix the Cat started in print, became animated stars, and then their animated fame drove more comic strip sales. It was the first true transmedia ecosystem.
It is interesting to think about that feedback loop. Today, we think of it as franchise management, but it was happening naturally between the newsstand and the cinema screen 100 years ago.
Precisely. And that ecosystem remained relatively stable for decades. You had hand-drawn animation on TV, hand-drawn animation in the cinema. The techniques got better, the colors got brighter, but the fundamental process, drawing a picture, taking a photo of it, drawing the next picture, remained the same.
Until the computer arrived. Until the pixel replaced the pencil.
That was the earthquake.
This was not an overnight shift, though, was it? We tend to think of Toy Story as the beginning, but there were experiments before that.
There were.
Yeah.
You could look at a film like Tron in 1982. It used early CGI, and it looks very primitive now. Glowing geometric shapes, tanks that look like boxes. But it was the proof of concept. But you are right, the paradigm shift was 1995.
Toy Story.
Toy Story. It was the first fully computer-generated feature film. And the statistics behind it are still mind-boggling. We talk about rendering, but I do not think people appreciate what that actually means.
What does it mean?
It means the computer has to calculate the path of light for every single pixel on the screen. It has to figure out, if a light hits Buzz Lightyear's helmet, how does it reflect? How does the shadow fall on the floor? Does the light bounce off the floor and hit the wall?
And it does that for every frame.
For every frame. And there were 24 frames in a second. For Toy Story, some individual frames took up to 30 hours for the computer to process. The total rendering time was something like 800,000 machine hours.
That is astronomical.
It was. And the result was something we had never seen before. Suddenly, characters had dimension. Light bounced off them. Plastic looked like plastic. It grossed $373 million globally, but more importantly, it signaled the end of an era.
It felt like traditional animation died for a while there.
It nearly did. In Hollywood, at least.
Yeah.
After the success of Pixar and then DreamWorks, the studios decided that hand-drawn was old. They dismantled the desks, they sold the light boxes. But the mid-2000s, if it was not 3D, it was not getting made by a major studio.
But trends are cyclical. And that brings us to the present day. We're recording this in 2026, looking back at the last few years, and specifically looking at 2024, which seems to have been a watershed year for the industry.
2024 was a fascinating year because it proved two things. Firstly, that animation is financially the most powerful sector in Hollywood. And secondly, that audiences are tired of things looking the same.
Let us talk about the finances first.
Yeah.
Because the numbers are staggering.
They are. The headline story of 2024 was Inside Out 2. It became the highest-grossing animated film of all time, pulling in $1.69 billion globally. It surpassed Frozen 2.
And it did that incredibly quickly.
It crossed the $1 billion mark in just 19 days. To put that in perspective, it beat major live-action blockbusters released that year like Dune, Part 2, and Deadpool and Wolverine. It was the first animated film to top the yearly box office in over a decade.
Why do you think that is? Why did Inside Out 2 connect so hard?
I think there's an animation advantage. We are seeing superhero fatigue. We are seeing franchise fatigue in live action. But animation has a unique ability to be fatigue-proof because it is not bound by reality. Inside Out 2 takes place inside a mind. It deals with anxiety as a character. You cannot film that with a camera. You have to create it.
It visualized an internal struggle that everyone was feeling.
Exactly. It gave a visual language to mental health. And there is the economic reality. Families. If a family goes to see Inside Out 2, they buy 3 or 4 tickets, they buy the snacks. It is a multiplier effect that action movies for adults simply do not have. And the studios know this. Look at the other hits from that year. Moana 2 crossed $1 billion. Kung Fu Panda 4 pushed that franchise past $2 billion total. Despicable Me 4 continued its dominance. These are highly profitable properties.
But you mentioned a second trend, that audiences are tired of things looking the same. For a while, every CGI movie looked like it came from the same factory, the standard 3D style. But that is changing.
It is. We're seeing a massive diversification in style. In 2024, we saw Wallace and Gromit. Vengeance Most Foul. That is stop motion. It is clay. You can see the fingerprints of the animators on the characters' faces. It is tactile and messy, and people loved it because it felt human.
And anime has finally truly conquered the global market, hasn't it?
It has gone completely mainstream. You had shows like Delicious in Dungeon premiering on Netflix and finding massive global audiences. It is no longer a niche interest. However, it was not all good news for anime in 2024. We saw the bankruptcy of Gainax in May of that year.
That is a legendary name.
It is. They made incredibly influential shows. Their collapse marked the end of a specific era of Japanese studio history. But as one falls, others rise. We also saw fascinating hybrid films. The Wild Robot used a painted style that looked like concept art coming to life. And a film called Ghost Cat Anzu used rotoscoping tracing over live-action actors to create something that felt very distinct and strange.
It feels like we are entering a new golden age, where the tools are so advanced that we can go back to being experimental. We can make things look like clay or paint or ink, but with the power of a supercomputer behind it.
That is the beauty of it. We are not limited by the technology anymore. We are only limited by the artistic choice. And we are seeing the rise of dedicated spaces for this history too. In June 2024, a network called MeTV Toons launched, dedicated 24/7 to classic cartoons. So we have the future pushing boundaries and a dedicated space preserving the past.
It really creates a complete picture. From the bison on the cave wall trying to run in the torchlight to the billion-dollar emotions of Inside Out 2 trying to explain the human condition.
It is one continuous line.
So if we step back and look at this entire arc, we have gone from stone to silicon, we have gone from firelight to laser projection. But the intent seems to remain exactly the same.
The intent is a refusal to accept the static nature of the world. Live-action film is wonderful, but it is bound by physics. It is bound by what you can put in front of a lens. You cannot film a dream directly. You cannot film a metaphor.
But you can draw one.
You can animate one.
Yeah.
Animation is humanity's way of saying reality has limits, but imagination does not. It allows us to document the impossible, whether that is the internal geography of a brain or a dinosaur interacting with a man on a stage in 1914. It is the only medium that is truly boundless.
It has been a fascinating journey, tracing this line from 30,000 years ago to the box office records of today. And it leaves me with one final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We look back at those cave paintings, at the eight-legged bison, and we see the primitive beginnings of a great desire. We look at Steamboat Willie and see a charming, jerky relic.
We do.
But if we have come this far in 30,000 years, what does animation look like 30,000 years from now? Perhaps our descendants will look back at Inside Out 2 with all its billions of pixels and processing power and find it just as primitive, just as flat and silent as we find those bison on the cave wall. It is a humbling thought. The story isn't over. It is just moving to the next frame. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into knowledge. We will see you next time.